When you're talking about spearfishing equipment, right at the heart of all spearfishing equipment is the spear gun. If you're spearfishing seriously, you can use slings if you're doing it more in a casual way, but if you're spearfishing seriously, you need a decent spear gun. And I've had more than 20 years experience diving, so I've had a lot of different spear guns that I've used, and I'll talk you through my experiences and what I've found that is useful throughout that time. When I first started out, a long time ago, I had my first gun was a Sea Hornet. The Sea Hornet was a very common gun in Australia many decades ago. It was one of the early ones because there was a lot of fish around. You didn't really need a high-performing weapon in order to land fish back then. The Sea Hornet that I had, the shaft was too big for the amount of power you had, and it would just, we're trying to shoot small fish with a big shaft and it would just bounce off a lot. But the main purpose of that initial gun was it was very cheap, and it was just an initial purchase to get you in the water. So that was all about just getting you in the water and seeing it, getting a feel for the sport. So I wasn't going to stick with the Sea Hornet that long. It was just to get me over that hump of, I think I like this, I'm going to pursue it. From then, with a couple of the other guys, we sort of moved into a few different European guns, Escapes, Picasso, there was a few guns like that. They were better, they had a thinner shaft, and we were starting to get more and more fish this way, and picking up and just improving. One of the things they didn't have back then was they didn't actually have a rail. They had a couple of elevated points along the barrel that would hold up the shaft. So the rail improves the accuracy, and in those days a lot of them didn't have that. So we eventually upgraded and got a couple of other guns that had rails. One of the other guys got a Rob Allen at the time. I think I got another European gun that had a rail. So we started getting more accuracy that way. And then as time went on, I started investigating around what are the options we got in our area, and there was a local diver. He was an expat from South Africa. His name is Tony Hugh. He's quite well known in these parts, and a very experienced, very good spear fisherman. He'd immigrated out from South Africa and started making spear guns in Australia. So we contacted him and got him to make some guns for us, and we found them to be quite useful. So we had a couple of those, and then we started to spear some fish, and we started improving and getting more into it. And then we sort of got a bit of notoriety, and then got sponsorship from another South African company. So for a while there, we switched over to another South African company called Rabitech. There's been a lot of guns come out, a lot of equipment comes out of South Africa. For some reason, it's one country where there's just a lot of spearfishing interest. Particularly in Australia, where you get a lot of expats from South Africa moved out when the country went through a lot of challenges. They moved out to Australia, and it's amazing how many of them actually dive. So there's obviously a lot of interest there, and there was a lot of companies manufacturing equipment in South Africa, and it was high quality. At the time, in the early days, we found that a lot of the European equipment was a bit weaker. It was designed for their conditions where the fish are a lot smaller, and you could use stainless stuffs because you're not going to bend them on the fish. Whereas the South African equipment, we just found at that time that it was a lot more rugged, and what was coming out of America was a lot of the bigger stuff, the bigger tuna hunting stuff, which we weren't really into. So our focus went on to the South African. There was a lot of equipment coming out there, and Rob Allen was probably the elite in terms of manufacturing coming out of South Africa. So we got a couple of their guns at the time, early on. But with Rabitech, we did a couple of seasons spearfishing with their equipment. They were a mid-tier sort of company. I haven't seen them around for a while. There's been a number of other ones pop up. But after a while, we went back and found out that we preferred the Tony Hugh guns, which are the edge guns. So we drifted back, and we actually got more of those, and really just developed our spearfishing equipment from there. And what we found was we actually built up a kit. So I started out, what was common was a 1.2. That was a common gun that most people had. A lot of short diving people would have a 1.1, which is fine because you're hunting around the rocks and it makes a lot of sense. But we went 1.2 and then 1.3, and then I made a decision, particularly with a lot of the other guys. When we were diving out of Brisbane, we found that a lot of the fish we were hunting were either wahoo, mackerel, Spanish mackerel, or parrotfish was another common one we were getting. And the terrain, those mackerel, it just benefited to have a little bit more range, we found. And with the parrotfish, we found the terrain out of Brisbane where we were diving, it's quite open, so you get reasonably good viz. The fish can see you quite early in the dive, and it's not the type of terrain that's that easy to ambush fish. So often we were finding we're seeing a lot of fish, heaps of fish, and you know, we're getting quite a few, but it was just a numbers game. We thought, well, if we had a bit more range, we could probably land a few more of these, as long as it was accurate. So we approached Tony Hugh and we got a couple of longer guns made. They were 1.5 and my cousin actually got a 1.6. And we found that right up on the edge in terms of their 1.6 was actually an aluminium, but my 1.5 was carbon. And we found that that just gave us a lot of extra range, so we're able to just hit those fish at great distances. And they were accurate, so we were very happy. All the guys loved those edge spear guns, and we've used them ever since. We actually haven't changed. And we had a couple of early aluminium ones, but I switched all of my guns to carbon. The reason for that, there's a couple of reasons. One, with carbon, they were just lighter, and I was doing a lot of traveling to other countries, and I got stung once for being overweight, and I thought, well, I'm never letting that happen again, because it just stuffs up your budget when you're trying to plan a trip. So I switched all my guns to carbon fibre, much lighter. A couple of other advantages. We found that they were a bit easier to track in the water because they're lighter, but also being that carbon fibre is stronger than aluminium, the actual diameter of the barrel could be thinner compared to the aluminium, which meant that there's less resistance when you move through the water when you're tracking a fish, which is all very useful. It can be quite challenging, particularly in current. You want ease, you don't want your hand to be, because if your arm is straining when you're tracking, you're going to be having these little shakes, and it only takes a little shake. You won't even notice it, but it only takes a shake to be inaccurate with your shot. So there was that, and back in those days, carbon fibre, aluminium's stronger in terms of taking hits and taking abrasion. They have improved a hell of a lot since then, so carbon fiber's a lot tougher now. So they've made some advances there, so that's not so much of a problem. One other advantage with carbon fibre, it can take more pressure. Aluminium will bend under extreme pressure, so what we could do with our guns is we could double them up and increase the power. We wouldn't normally do that because it tends to stuff up your accuracy, but there were a couple of times where we were out chasing tuna and we really wanted to get some punch to get through without spending big dollars on a giant cannon, so we were trying to do a cheap way and load up, and you can only really do that with carbon fibre ones. And then Tony, in the later stages, he came out with a carbon fibre that had double the wall thickness internally, so it was even stronger. So I have one of those because my original 1.5 carbon fibre I lost in Fiji when a dogtooth tuna ripped the rig line right over the top of the reef and snapped it. It's the only gun I lost. It was quite a tragic moment. So overall, yeah, what I've found with guns, and I think a lot of people would find this too, is you actually get to a point where you get comfortable with a setup, and then you just stick with it for pretty much the rest of your life because you get so good with it and you get so used to it, and then you just don't want to change. I've played around with roller guns, the new development that came along a few years ago, and I've just done that in the pool. I found them quite cumbersome to navigate all the loading, so I didn't really like that, but I could see advantages in that, definitely. The ability to track easier because you're not so far, you're not projecting too far to the fish, so you could probably get closer to the fish, and travelling would be easier, shorter gun bags, just easier. I can definitely see some advantages to that, but you know, technology will keep advancing, and so it's always interesting to watch what's happening, but I think most of the guys are pretty set on the ways. We dive with some other guys that swear by a certain gun. It happens when you get a bit more experience and you just stick with it, and they'll never change. Nobody will ever change. So this is one of my guns, an Edge, you can see there. Superfrog Industries was the name of the game that Tony runs. You can see I have a rig line wrapped up on this. Just on that, we always wrap up our guns, even in the water when we get back in the boat. It's just nice and clean, doesn't get tangled. and it's not that hard. When you get used to it, to undo it in the water, you just slowly kick forward as you undo it. And sometimes if you're towing up to the front of a reef, you let it out with the float as the boat starts to slow down. So that's just something I do. We don't tend to dive with reel guns very often. The reason for that is we find them quite dangerous. I actually do have a reel gun, but the problem with reel guns, they should really be for experienced divers, very experienced divers. You feel incredibly free diving with it, but there are a number of serious risks with it. If you shoot something quite large that gets tangled up or pulls you down in deep water, you're going to have to make a decision, and you're going to be put in a difficult spot where you have to decide between letting the fish go, losing your equipment, or saving your life. And as stupid as that decision sounds, it sounds quite simple. Some people clearly make the wrong decision there and give it all up, because that's happened with a few people with reel guns. So I don't like that risk. The other thing is reel guns in the water, the boat driver finds it very hard to see, particularly if there's a bit of capping happening in the water, like it's a bit rough. Floats are far easier to see, so your boat driver can see you, and also other boats. When we go offshore we live in a city, so when we go offshore there's often a lot of boats around, and a lot of them will be trolling for pelagic fish, and they can easily run you over, and you'll be dead and won't even know about it. So if someone is diving with a reel gun, it's good to have another bloke next to him in the water who has a rig line and a float. At least that way there's some cover, and then potentially if the guy with the reel gun shoots something that's big, you could unclip and whack it onto the float. So yeah, you can do it as a team like that. The other advantage to a reel gun that we've found is it can be useful having it in the boat for a second shot, or if sometimes when you pull up to spot, there'll be a wahoo just come right up to the boat just for a bit of a quick look, and you only get a small window, and if you've got your gear on, you can roll over the reel gun, you can plug it, and then even hand the gun to someone in the boat who can just fish with it. So yes, we don't focus too much on reel guns, although there are advantages to it, but yes, definitely not something for the amateur to use out on a boat dive, I don't believe. So looking at this gun, this is my 1.3. What I tended to do back in the day was to add and make my own handle. It's customized. This was a Picasso handle, so Tony got this glass nylon type handle, which is very efficient and very good. And I made mine. You need this, you mix it up, it's like a putty for marine environments. Aqua, I think it's called Aqua Need It. You can get different types. So it's designed to fit my hand very, very neatly, and it feels really good in the water. And this is more of a psychological thing the reason I did that, because I love feeling like it's part of an extension of your arm. So to actually customize that was just something that I really wanted to have that extra benefit of extending my arm closer to the fish, having control over it. So you have to watch it though. You can it adds a little bit of weight at the end, so you just need to be aware of that. The other one is this has a rail like mini guns. You can probably see that there. They should all have rails. This one's a sticker flex one onto a carbon barrel. Some of them are embedded. Either way, the rail actually adds a lot of accuracy. There is a unique feature with the edge spear guns. It's a large hole. So a lot of spear guns would have what is called an aeroplane handle, muzzle. So there would be two rubbers coming out and it would be flat, and there might be a little tiny ridge where you sight over the top. You sight it to the end of the spear from the muzzle. So this is a little bit tricky to show, so I'm trying to show it with the torch here. You can see there's a large hole, my finger can fit in it. That is really good because I can look right down from the back end of the gun right through there out to the tip, and I sight fish that way. I'll be looking down the barrel off to the side up until the last second or two, and then I'll quickly shift my eyesight, closing one eye, bringing in sight through here and make a really accurate shot. I really love this large hole muzzle. So that's I think that's a patent he's got there. This one's actually damaged. You can see there's a big lump there. I had a dead fish on here that I was just loading my gun. I was going to cut it up, and then a shark came up and grabbed it and pulled it sideways and caused some damage there, which was a bit of a shock, but doesn't really matter for this. So yeah, the main key is being able to sight through here. It's a feature that I really love with this gun. Another thing that's unique to the Edge spear gun is this cap on the muzzle. So I can unscrew this and take the whole cap off. It just means that there's a bit more protection. This cap actually locks in the rubber. The rubber comes in, this is not a two-piece. It looks like a two-piece, like some guns have two pieces. The rubber actually wraps around internally. So the cap holds it in place, protects it from the sun. And you'll find with rubbers, when you've got pulled and pulled tight and over time, it gets a lot of sun on this part of it. And also it's under pressure there, so this is the part that tends to weaken and cracks over time. The other part being right up near this end. But the main thing that this protects is here. So I really like, I can take the cap off. I could replace this cap, which is damaged. I might do that at some point. But it's just another feature which I think is really good. So down near the handle, the attachment I use, and this is when I'm up the reef, I use what we call a shark clip. They call them something else. This one is not as heavy. You can get really heavy duty ones, but they're hard to squeeze. We only use them for the big stuff. So then we have a speed feeder, speed spike, whatever you want to call it. I use these when I'm up on the reef shooting a lot of reef fish, because I feed them on the line and I'll feed 2 or 3 on there. We used to do this all day long, but now we get a lot more shark problems. So I'll feed a couple on there, then I'll keep them close. That's when the boat's away from me. Maybe it's anchored and I've swum, you know, half a kilometre or, you know, quarter mile away from the boat, and then I'll head back, keeping the fish tight to me. But it enables you to feed the fish up on the line quite easily. If you just use the rope, it'll get caught in their gills. So this is quite handy. Some people put rubber on this because they find that this can, if you shoot a mackerel, some pelagic, this can fly through the water. And I have heard of people losing guns where something like a barracuda or something will come up and hit this and then slide down, and their teeth will just tear this to shreds, and then your gun will drop into deep water, be gone. I have heard of that happening, but yeah, pretty low risk, I think. So this is tied on down here. Sometimes I'll shake this to attract fish. It's just a technique. And I'll just whack it on here, whack it on here. It creates a lot of noise. It's quite handy. And I use a pigtail swivel, we call them. This is up that attaches the shooting line onto the gun. So what I can do with this pigtail swivel is I can unwind that. So I wind it out, and then it falls off the end. Like you can see that if I undo this at the bottom, I can just quickly wind that off. I might do that now. So you can see I can quickly, that is detached, and I can change out a spear very quickly. I've done this many times when a fish has got stuck and I want to get the gun free, but I can only pull a spear through. Sometimes you can't get a spear out, but you can push it through, and so I can unclip this, pull this shaft out the other side of a bommy or a rock, and then take it up and reattach it, which is quite simple. And you can do this, it's not too difficult to do this in the water, even with gloves. It's not very difficult, so I quite like that. There are other ones where you clasp. I actually find them a bit annoying because the ones you clasp, they sometimes can like bend sideways. This one's quite simple and I know what I'm doing with it. So pigtail swivel, it's probably got a more official name than that. So in my arsenal I also have a little prey gun. So this is a 0.6, so the shaft is 1 meter. This shaft has been in this gun for probably more than 15 years. It's rusted hell. I don't actually maintain this because these shafts are hard to find, but also I'm only using it to shoot crays that are sort of here. We're allowed to shoot crays in the state that I live. We can grab them by hand, but a lot of the structure where you are, they'll see you and they'll just go back into the cave you can't reach in. It's quite common, so it's a lot better to actually be able to shoot them. But yeah, I just use this gun. I don't use it very often. We don't do it too often. It doesn't get much use these days. But yeah, it has, I think, 14 mil rubbers on it. It doesn't need much power. I've actually shot a few fish like this where I've come face to face with them and it's actually landed a couple fish, surprisingly. But it's always fun when that happens, when you've got one on, because you're on the bottom and you've got this tiny shooting. This doesn't go very far, so you've just got the fish right in front of you and you've got to swim it up. So it's always a challenge. But yes, I don't do anything with this. It's handy to have because sometimes someone will find a cray and they'll yell, "You got the cray gun?" and then we'll throw it over and they'll deal with it. Just useful to have in the boat most of the time. Some people will actually hook these onto the back of the float and just swim along and then pull in the float, go back, grab this gun and go find the cray if they come across the coral bommy that has a cray in it. So that's quite another common technique that's used up north. So this is my 1.5. I currently have 2 rubbers on this, 2 16s. The reason I did that, I went to the Pacific Islands and I was chasing dogtooth and I just wanted a little bit more punch, so I did that. And I've actually kept them on ever since. When I originally went to the 1.5s, one of the challenging parts of doing that was that you needed a fair bit of strength to load the 20 mils that I was using. So you need a fair bit of strength, but I was doing a lot of weight training, so I was able to do that. But I'm a bit shorter, so it was quite challenging. If you're longer, taller, longer arms, it was a bit easier. So as I've gotten older, I just don't like so much to use the 20 mils anymore. For the big gun, I don't mind for the 1.3, 1.2 that I have. So I'm probably just going to stick with this now, the twin 16s. So that's just something to be aware of as you get older. You just want it to be a bit easier, and you might take several shots in a day, and you just have to constantly load it. So I used to end up with a sore back even when I was younger because I was firing away a lot, and it was tough to load sometimes. So yeah, that's another thing. So this one being the 1.5 was a later version. After I lost my other gun in Fiji, I got a new one of this, and this is an earlier version. Yeah, this is also carbon fibre, but this is the earlier model. This is a thicker, the 1.5 is the thicker wall. It's kind of a heavier carbon fibre, stronger, but I wanted it in the 1.5 because the 1.5 is under more pressure, and what you don't want in a barrel is you don't want too much pressure that creates flex. That's where a barrel is no longer straight because you put so much pressure on it, and when you have that scenario, whenever you pull the trigger, it's going to try to straighten, but that's going to create a whip, and your spear is going to kind of whip through the water and not be accurate. So I was okay to have a little bit extra weight and a little bit of toughness with the longer gun. Didn't care about the shorter gun so much because it's not under the same pressure. So with your spear gun, when you go to load it, what I do is make sure the shooting line is sorted out first. That just makes it a lot easier. So the shooting line was attached to a little release there, and then you pull the trigger, that releases, and then the whole shaft will unlock inside this mechanism and go firing out. Some of these are on the side of some guns. I prefer it on the bottom because it's out of the way. I tend to would hit the side. I think if you're lying your gun on the boat and the shooting mechanism is on the side, you might have it the wrong way down and it can rattle, particularly going over rough seas. So that's what I've always found. It's better to have it underneath, just as a design perspective. In terms of your shooting line, I always cut this pretty short, this part, so that it's not interfering with your groove there for your when you pull back your rubbers. And you want it to have enough time when it shoots out and it flips back over, and then it won't impede going out through the muzzle. Sometimes when you fire, if not everything's lined up, you might get something caught in here. It's pretty rare for this type of gun with a large hole muzzle, but I know on other guns that happens a bit. So you want to be just sure that you're nice and clean down this end, and that will prevent that. In terms of loading the gun, I use my strong hand. I'm right-handed. I grab the rubber like that, and then I use my left hand, which I bring behind the handle, and I will push forward, still holding with my right until I get the left up into the chest, sort of between the pecs. I've got a loading pad there, and this is a lot easier in the water. And when I've got it like that, I can bring my left hand forward and grab the rubber, which is pulled down because you've already got pressure from your right, which is holding strong. And then I pull it back. You're doing it looking down in the water, so I think it just works easy with the gravity and everything. So your body's actually holding it pretty steady. It's harder to do out of the water. But it's pretty simple. As long as you get used to it and you do it in a streamlined, sort of consistent way and don't wobble too much, you'll actually get used to it and you build up the muscle strength. It doesn't take a hell of a lot. And you don't want to overload your guns anyway. You don't want to make them too strong. That actually creates a lot of inconsistencies with the shot. It'll flex through the water. There'll be too much power, you'll get a whip action and then it just won't be accurate. And I've seen that with a lot of videos I've played back where I've got my gun overloaded, and you'll see that the spear doesn't go straight, it actually whips. And sometimes if you're wondering if you're hitting fish but the shaft seems to be sliding off them, it's hitting their scales and sliding off, it's probably because, well, some fish have big scales, but it's probably because it's not hitting it directly square on, it's actually at an angle with the tip when it's hitting it. So it can be the shot, but a lot of time it's just overpowered. So it's quite ironic, and it's a seduction where you want to chase more power, thinking that's going to be your solution, but often it's a bit of a trap, because you're actually more power makes you inaccurate. Best to focus on getting close to the fish as possible and placing a good shot. So that's my experiences with spear guns. And as I showed you in terms of my gun bag, I would have a small cray gun that I don't use too often these days, and I've got 1.2, a 1.3 and a 1.5. They're all carbon because they're nice and light, easy to track in the water. I don't use the 1.5 as much as I used to when I was younger. I tend to use the 1.3, I find it more versatile. I can hunt those reef fish, but I can also have enough range to pull down those Spanish mackerel and that type of pelagic. And yeah, it's quite an easy gun for me to do that with. I think if for someone else who's getting into the sport, you might want to just go for a cheaper gun to start out with and just see if you like spearfishing, and if you want to really get into it and get more into boat diving, go further out, and then you want to assess your local conditions. What type of water do you dive in? In terms of the visibility, that'll have a big impact on the length of gun that you want, and in terms of the type of fish. If you've got a lot of really small fish, you probably want to go for stainless steel shafts that will last a long time, because you're not going to have much problem with fish bending them. So, but if you just want to go for standard shafts, if you've got a lot of tough fish, like where I dive, a lot of fish just beat the crap out of the spear. When you shoot them, they take in a hole and thrash it around, or other fish will just bend it. So I go for a cheaper shaft, but I go through those shafts. So that's just a consumable. So yeah, a lot of it, like all things to do spearfishing, depends on your local conditions and what you're dealing with. But yeah, there's just a few ideas there. I hope it helps you out.